Good evening. My name is Warren Palmer. I'm a professor in the Department of Economics here at Beloit College, and it has been my pleasure to organize this year's Upton Forum. And I want to, quite selfishly, spend as little time up here talking as I can, because I'm much more interested in listening to what Professor Stavins has to say than in what I have to say. But before I introduce him, it's really important that I thank some of the people who've made this evening possible. Certainly I should start with all the physical plant staff and all the workers of Bon Appetit who have done everything possible to make this event come off so well. I also want to thank the members of my senior seminar in economics who have been studying the work of Professor Stavins all semester long. I particularly wish to thank Jeff Adams, who suggested this year's topic. Other faculty who've played an important role are numerous science faculty members who willingly gave their time for a Science of Climate Change series that met every Monday over this semester, in which my students from the Econ seminar attended and many other faculty, staff, and students attended. I particularly want to thank all of the students, staff, and professors who have attended these talks so far this week. We had two terrific panel discussions on Tuesday night and another one on Thursday night. Today we had a panel discussion on the ideas and influence of Robert N. Stavins that was simply a tour de force of intellectual excitement and interest. I also want to thank all of the professors and students who met with this year's Upton Scholar in their classes. And I want to thank all of you for coming out tonight and engaging with this important topic of climate change and how do we craft policies that can help address that. And the last person group I want to thank are the people who've been working on organizing this for a very long time, and that would be Jennifer Kodal and her two student workers, Zoe and John, who have worked so hard over this semester to make this whole event come off. So please let us thank all of those people. Let me say just a few words about the program that makes tonight's event possible. Dedicated alumni and friends of Miller Upton funded the Miller Upton Endowments to honor the 6th president of Beloit College. Miller Upton devoted his career to advancing the ideals of the liberal society, political freedom, the rule of law, and the promotion of peace and prosperity through the voluntary exchange of goods, services, and ideas. He felt that transforming the ideals of liberal democracy into real institutions was at the heart of increasing the wealth and well-being of nations and peoples. Through the Miller Upton programs, students and faculty engage with those questions that are central to promoting the wealth and well-being of nations. Questions such as, what drives human progress? Why do some societies prosper while others remain poor? What economic institutions and policies are essentials for the good of society? Each year, an eminent specialist on these questions is named the Miller Upton Scholar and visits campus for a 4-day residency called the Miller Upton Forum. Each Miller Upton Scholar is an internationally recognized expert who, working within the classical liberal tradition, has significantly contributed to understanding the sources of the wealth and well-being of nations. During the Miller Upton Forum, we bring other prominent scholars and practitioners to campus. This year, we brought 11 other speakers, and all of them working in the Upton Scholars area of inquiry. So now let me tell you about this year's Upton Scholar. Harvard professor Robert N. Stavins is one of the world's leading thinkers on climate change policy, and he is a very busy man. He is the Albert Pratt Professor of Business and Government, Director of the Harvard Environmental Economics Program, Chairman of the Environment and Natural Resources Faculty Group at the John F. Kennedy School of Government, Director of Graduate Studies for the Doctoral Program in Public Policy and the Doctoral Program in Political Economy and Government, co-chair of the Harvard Business School, Kennedy School Joint Degree Programs, and the Director of the Harvard Project on Climate Agreements. I don't know when he sleeps, but we are delighted that he was able to find time in his schedule to join us for these 4 days. And one of the things that we discovered in these 4 days is that while this may be the first time that he's come to Beloit College, his career path is one that Beloit students and Beloit alumni would readily recognize. He graduated the undergraduate degree from Northwestern University with a major in philosophy. He then spent 4 years in the Peace Corps in Sierra Leone working on rice farming. He returned to the United States, got a degree in agricultural economics at Cornell University, and then worked as an economist for the Environmental Defense Fund. He saw that he needed more training, more skills to pursue his policy interests, and then went to the Harvard Economics Department to do a PhD, and graduated from that program and joined the Kennedy School, where he has been ever since, serving his multiple roles as educator and as a theorist and as a developer of public policy. So please welcome Robert N. Stavins.
Just looking for something here. Warren, I think you picked up a piece of paper of mine. Yeah, I'm not sure what the value would be. Well, thank you very much, Warren, for giving me back my notes, as well as that very kind introduction. But also I want to thank Warren and thank President Bierman. Thanks to the many faculty members with whom I've met and I've worked over these days, the alumni of the university that I've worked over these days, and the very large number of students with whom I've met and spoken over the past 4 days. The intellectual engagement in which I've been privileged to participate, as well as the marvelous hospitality that I've experienced, are both truly unforgettable. By my count, over the past 4 days, I've spoken to approximately a dozen classes, largely in economics and in international relations. We've had some great discussions in those classes about environmental economics and climate change policy, and then I've had the privilege of participating in 3 panel sessions during the week, as well as several dinners with panelists, faculty, students, and other friends of the university. So the hospitality has been wonderful. Warren is a remarkable man. He has picked me up and dropped me off everywhere I need to be. The first evening, I more or less expected he was going to come upstairs at the hotel and tuck me in. But it turned out, fortunately, he didn't. So with that, let me turn to what are my more substantive remarks, if I could. Tank up. So as you can see, my topic is, what can an economist possibly have to say about climate change anyway? And so to think about that, to get us started, let me tell you a story that not terribly long ago, I got on a plane and sat down in my seat. And as I sat down in the seat, it became clear to me that the gentleman seated next to me wanted to have a conversation. And maybe you've noticed what I have, and that there are two kinds of people who fly: those who like to have conversations with perfect strangers, and then the rest of us. So I'm very much in that second category. I always have my work in front of me, a newspaper, a book, whether or not I'm interested in it, just to fend off an unwanted conversation. But he was determined, and he started the conversation the way an American typically would. It's polite in this culture. He said, "What business are you in? You know, what do you do for a living?" And I did something foolish. I told the truth. I said, "I'm an environmental economist." So he looked at me, and I looked at him, and he didn't follow up. And I'm certainly not going to say anything, since I don't want to talk in the first place. And we continued to look into each other's eyes for what seemed like a significant amount of time. And then it dawned upon me. Then I realized why it was that this fellow who so much wanted to have a conversation wasn't following up. And it was, I decided, because he had concluded that he had just met a living, breathing oxymoron, an internal contradiction. After all, it's either the environment or the economy. It's either environmental studies or economics. So what could this phrase even mean? It made no sense, an internal contradiction. So my purpose initially is simply to assert, and I hope demonstrate to you this evening, that environmental economics is not oxymoronic. Far from it. And I say this first of all because the causes of environmental problems in a market economy, such as exists not only in the United States, but in the vast majority, nearly all the countries of the world, except for a handful, that in a market economy, the causes of environmental problems are economic. They're unintended side effects of market activity. As a result of perfectly desirable activity of firms, of companies, producing goods and services that we want, as a result of our meritorious activity as consumers of buying and using goods and services that we want, and a side effect of that is the emission of pollutants. So because these emissions then in terms of decision making are external to our decisions, they're external to the firm's decisions, economists label these as externalities. But the consequences of environmental problems also have important economic dimensions. So if on the one hand, the causes of environmental problems are economic, and on the other hand, the causes of environmental problems have important economic dimensions, then surely an economic perspective can be useful. In fact, I'm going to say something much stronger than it can be useful, that it is essential. It's essential for a full understanding of environmental problems, and therefore it could be exceptionally helpful for the design of solutions that will be effective, economically sensible, and because they're economically sensible, by which I mean cost effective, therefore they're more likely to be, although not necessarily, but more likely to be politically pragmatic. Now, this kind of economic thinking, it turns out, is particularly important for the formulation of effective, sensible, and politically feasible climate policies. And so that's where I'm going to turn my attention for the rest of our time together, to think about what is really an economic perspective, an policy analytic perspective on climate policies. And the reality, as in so much of environmental economics, that any of the other scholars who are here tonight, whether they're from Beloit College or they're from some other institution, would tell you that in the environmental economics realm, we can't just be stuck within economics, unfortunately. Rather, what we need to do is to build upon the science. The science leads to the economics, And the economics then has tremendous implications for politics. And so too, I'm going to show you how the basic science of climate change leads to the fundamental economic realities of climate change, and that produces the geopolitics of climate change, which is where we begin to see the problems, the challenges, and eventually at the end, I'll show you what I think might be the path ahead. So the scientific reality, the first one, is that greenhouse gases mix in the atmosphere. That means that the location of emissions has no effect. It doesn't matter if the greenhouse gases come from your car or barbecue grill in Beloit, or they come from a power plant in Beijing, or they come from an aircraft that's taking off from O'Hare Field in Chicago. It makes no difference in terms of the ultimate damages and the location of the damages, because these greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, methane, and the others, they mix in the atmosphere, in the upper atmosphere. Now, why is that so important? What does that do? It produces something in economics which we're going to refer to as a global commons problem. Namely, it means that any individual jurisdiction that takes action, whether it's a city, it's a state, it's an entire country, or even a region such as the European Union, it will incur the costs of taking action, and those costs might be the cost of switching from coal to petroleum to natural gas, greater use of energy efficiency, a host of other things, and switching to renewables, zero carbon release. They'll incur the costs, but the benefits, that is, reduced damages of climate change, are going to be spread globally. But that means something then very significant. That means that for virtually any jurisdiction, since it's paying the costs, but the benefits of its actions are spread globally, that the direct benefits it receives are going to be very, very small. I mean, to a first order of approximation, you might think that it's whatever share of the footprint of the earth it occupies, that's its share of the benefits. Now, that's not exactly right, but that's not a bad approximation to start with. But that means then that for virtually every jurisdiction, and I think I could say every, that the direct climate benefits it receives from its actions are going to be smaller, much smaller than the costs that it incurs, even though the global benefits of its actions might well exceed the cost, and indeed might well exceed the cost by a significant amount. So that means it's not in the interest of any of these individual players, such as countries, to take action. And that is essentially a global commons problem, and it presents what both economists and political scientists refer to as a free rider problem. That is, it is in the interest, therefore, of every country to not do anything, but to get the benefits of other countries taking action. That's a free rider issue. And that's why international, as you'll see, not necessarily global, but international cooperation will be essential. And it's why the highest levels of effective governance, which in the world you and I live in, with one exception, is the nation state, the exception being the European Union. It's why the highest level of national governments also have to be involved. Now, when we look at national governments, in particular when we look at the U.S., most policy analysts, whether they're economists or they're some other discipline, they tend to favor carbon pricing. And by carbon pricing, what I'm referring to is either a tax on the carbon content of the three fossil fuels proportional to their carbon content, which is largely going to be a tax on coal, or it could be a cap and trade system, again designed in parallel ways that again will implicitly through the market place a price on carbon emissions. Now, why is it that there's all this support? It's not ideological. It's not because economists like the market. It's for very pragmatic reasons. The first reason is that there is no other feasible approach that could provide what I'll refer to as meaningful emissions reductions. And by meaningful, I mean in the U.S. context, achieving what is actually the government's official target and our target in the international negotiation discussions, which is an 83% cut in CO2 emissions below the 2005 level by 2050. That's a very serious cut in CO2, carbon dioxide emissions. So that's the first reason. And why is it that there's no other feasible approach? Because we're not talking about a few thousand factories that are emitting. We're talking about hundreds of millions of sources. So every electricity generator, every industrial facility, every commercial facility, every residence, every car, every lawnmower, go on and on and on. This is hundreds of millions of sources. Hundreds of millions of sources that how they're used, when they're used, and if they're used are affected by many, many hundreds of millions of economic decisions every day. And what the market does is that it sends out information to affect those decisions. Indeed, that's what a market is in the first place, any kind of market. It's a device for transmitting information, information about relative scarcity. That's what it does. It tells us what's valued more, what's valued less by people. So it's for that reason that this approach with carbon pricing is feasible. The others, we could never design a set of regulations that could do the job. But even if we could, this approach turns out to be cheaper, to be cost effective, because it sends incentives for controllers that have faced very high costs to shed some responsibilities, and controllers who could do a lot more to take on more responsibility. And so in aggregate, we get a cost-effective, cost-minimizing approach. And thirdly, it's important to use markets because it will be the least costly approach in the long term. Climate change is a long-term problem. We're not thinking about this year, 10 years from now. We're thinking about the year 2050. Even off to the end of the century. That's the right terms to have in mind in doing analysis and thinking about sound policy. And in order to achieve these very ambitious targets that certainly natural scientists talk about, such as the US target I mentioned, it's going to be necessary to bring about a tremendous amount of technological change. In other words, we could not accomplish it with existing technologies simply by deploying them more. We can all drive Priuses, it's not going to do the job. All coal plants could shift to natural gas, it's not going to do the job. Rather, what we're going to need are new technologies, invention and innovation of new technologies. And why then? For that reason, that's why we need long-term price signals. Because when firms create a new technology and when individuals adopt them, firms adopt them, they're not just looking at relative prices today, they're looking at the price over the life of that plant and equipment. And if you're making a 40-year investment in a new factory, then you want to know what's the price of energy going to be over that 40-year life. So this is the least costly approach in the long term as well. Now, policies that would achieve this could either be carbon taxes or they could be cap and trade mechanisms. You know, if we were in the classroom when we'd just been together for 2/3 of a semester, then maybe we'd look at technically at how these instruments differ. They do differ in some subtle ways, but the main way that they differ is politically. That's the main way that they differ. Carbon taxes and cap and trade mechanisms. And because of the politics, I'm just looking at the revealed preference of what has happened around the world, most policies have favored cap and trade over carbon taxes, which is not to say that they are in some sense theoretically superior. It is rather simply to say what's happened. Partly this has been because of previous experience there had been with these. And so what happens is that one jurisdiction uses a particular approach, another jurisdiction looks at it, and I'll show you precisely how that's happened by going through some experience with cap and trade policies. The first experience was during the Reagan administration in the United States, when the Environmental Protection Agency used a trading program among refineries, gasoline refineries, oil refineries, in order to bring down the lead content of gasoline. And we got unleaded gasoline, which has a lead content of 10% compared to what it was previously. The result of that is that we saved for refineries, largely passed on to consumers in the price of gasoline, about $250 million a year, and got the leaded gasoline out of the market faster than anyone ever thought was possible. I should say, in terms of the tax approach instead, at the same time that we were doing it that way in the United States, in Europe, they accomplished the same thing through differential taxation of leaded gasoline compared to unleaded gasoline. But that's because Europe certainly then had a very different view of taxation than the United States does. You know, going back to that Tea Party in Boston where I come from, we've had a very negative view of using taxes for any purposes, let alone for achieving social objectives. Probably the most important use of this program up until that time was in the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments, on which I did a great deal of work, and that was the development of a trading program of sulfur dioxide emissions among electric power plants. This cut acid rain, which was the concern at the time, by half over the period 1995 to 2010, and it saved, compared to what would have been anticipated without the plan in place, and with the kind of policy that we were about to use instead, which is what I think of as the right counterfactual, we saved about $1 billion per year on a $3 billion cost base, so about a 33% cost savings. That program was highly successful. Because of its success, when the European Union decided to put in place a climate policy, that became their model. Now, for reasons we can talk about later if you're interested, that turned out not to be the best model. The right model for them, in my view, would have been the leaded gasoline phase down. But they looked at the SO2 allowance trading program, and they designed the European Union emissions trading system, which is now the largest cap and trade system in the world, the largest market-based instrument in the world, and it is for climate. So we're now moving from leaded gasoline to acid rain and into climate policy finally. And the EU ETS has been operating successfully. It has had what people would call problems, i.e. low allowance prices, but that's because it's worked well. There was recession in Europe, and what happens with a cap and trade program when there's recession is there is less demand for allowances, less economic activity, less emissions, and so the price goes down. In other words, it is, in the language of economics, a counter-cyclical policy instrument, as opposing to unnecessarily continuing to punish industry with a carbon tax, which is what would, during the recession, which is what would happen with that approach. This is a counter-cyclical instrument. It's one of those, somewhat subtle differences between the two approaches, some of which I'll acknowledge go the other direction, by the way, to favor carbon taxes. In the United States, there's also been put in place a cap and trade system. It's called the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or RGGI, started in 2009. In its first phase, it was never binding because of low natural gas prices, as well as the recession, as well as some moderate weather in the Northeast. This is 9 northeastern states. We may see it soon to expand to include Pennsylvania. So that's a U.S. program. And then finally, the program I'm really going to talk with you about, so I've put it in italics, is a program in California. California likes to think of itself not as part of the United States. Texas is not the only state that does that. California does that as well, but they do it in a different way. They like to think of themselves as their own country. And people in California, if you talk with them, are always reminding you that it's the 9th largest economy in the world. It was the 8th largest, so it's fallen down, but the 9th largest economy in the world. And in truth, California has often led the way in the United States in environmental policy. That has been in air pollution policy since 1970. They'd put in place regulations in California, and then eventually the feds would follow up. So California has put in place a very ambitious climate policy. It's more ambitious than the proposal you may have heard about that was in the U.S. Congress that passed the House and failed in the Senate. So I'm going to talk about it, not because it's so important in and of itself, but because we can learn some lessons. Just as in our personal lives, the way we learn on the job is when we mess up, right? When we make a mistake, that's how you learn. And the way we learn from policy experiences is when something goes wrong. So I want to look at lessons from the program, both lessons from what's gone right, but importantly, lessons from what they didn't do so well in terms of design. So first of all, this policy is called the Global Warming Solutions Act. Given what I said at the beginning of the impossibility of an individual country, let alone a state, solving the problem, that's a rather bizarre title, but that's what they felt good about. It's a broad and a very ambitious policy. It's not just on carbon dioxide, it's on greenhouse gas emissions, and the targets are to cut the emissions by the year 2020 to the 1990 level. And that means cutting them tremendously below what business as usual emissions would otherwise be in 2020. It combines lots of aspects. It has in it energy efficiency standards for vehicles, for buildings and appliances. It has renewable portfolio standards for the generation of electricity. And it has a particular policy that affects refineries called a low carbon fuel standard. And it also, and I'll come back to some of these, it also has a cap and trade system, but that's what we're going to focus on. And the cap covers 85% of the economy, at least it will January 1st, 2015. And the cap declines from 2012 through 2020. It's the declining cap, of course, that brings about emissions reductions. They use auctions, so they generate a tremendous amount of revenue. There are increasing auctions of the allowances over time. The big discussion now in California, of course, is how to spend all of that money. There are lots of interesting side stories about that, both legally and economically. And it's really not just a cap and trade system. It's really a hybrid of a cap and trade system and a tax, which we've long known in the economics literature is the ideal thing in terms of the most efficient instrument. For almost all circumstances, is a combination of the two. So it's really a hybrid. And the way it does this is that it has a price collar. It has a cap on what the price of allowances can be, and it has a floor. And that moves up over time, which is how emissions are brought down. Now, if that price collar were really, really, really narrow, it becomes a tax. Okay? But the price collar is not extremely narrow, so there's cap and trade operations, but when it bumps up against it, it's becoming a tax, at least temporarily. And importantly, it seeks to provide protection for trade-sensitive industries. This is a huge issue. Any jurisdiction that wants to take action on a pollution problem and my competitors are not doing the same thing, I'm going to worry about competition. So that's a big issue. It turns out it's a bigger political issue than it is an economic issue, but it's very important just for that reason, that it's a big political issue. So I'll show you how they do it. So, but that's as much as I'm going to say about the program itself. Let me try to share with you a few lessons that have come out from, in addition to working with the state a great deal in Sacramento and San Francisco over the last, I don't know, it's been 5 years or so. I go out there a lot to help them design it. I've also done a lot of work on analyzing it. So this is more coming from the analysis. So the first thing that comes out of this is that carbon pricing, as I said, is necessary. I said that at the beginning, but that doesn't mean that carbon pricing is sufficient, because there are other market failures other than this externality with regards to greenhouse gases. Now, one of them that I'll mention that turns out is quite significant in California and gets a lot of attention is what economists would call a principal agent problem, but let me describe it to you instead. And that is renter-occupied properties, whether it is an apartment, it's a commercial establishment with a lease, or it's an industrial facility with a lease. But think about the apartment. So I'm renting the apartment, and I'm paying the energy bills, let's say the electricity bills and the fuel bills for my apartment. Now, it might be the case that given the price of energy, it would make sense for me, it would be efficient in economic terms for me to put more insulation in the walls. But if I'm a renter, I'm not going to put more insulation in the walls, because what's going to happen? I rented it for a couple of years, I move on, I'm not going to be able to pull the insulation out of the walls and put them on eBay and recoup my investment. Rather, it's going to go on to someone else. In fact, the landlord is then going to capitalize that into the value of the property. So as a renter, I don't have an incentive to do anything. Well, what about the landlord? Well, the landlord doesn't have an incentive to do it because he's not paying or she's not paying the energy bills. So this is a principal agent problem, and what would be the efficient amount of insulation, I'm just taking that as an example, will not be put in place because of what is in economics language a market failure, and it's this principal agent problem. So that means you might want to have some other kind of policies, and it might be building codes, it might be zoning. There are a variety of policies now that a very significant number of cities across the United States are using, including in California, to address that. So carbon pricing is necessary but not sufficient. The reason I bring this up is simply to say that in certain cases, specific non-pricing policies can be, I want to emphasize, can be complementary. But in fact, some complementary policies that are called that, and we have them in California, and we have them in Europe, they conflict rather than they complement. So the example I'm going to give you is of the low carbon fuel standards, but this also applies with the renewable electricity standards in California. Because the situation is that we have a cap and trade system. I'm trying to draw a picture of a cap with my hands. It's like an umbrella here. This is the cap. And emissions cannot go above that level in the cap. And by the way, from what I told you before, the responsibility for where the emissions are going to come from and the reductions that are going to come from will be allocated by the market in a way that's cost effective. We're achieving the cap in the lowest cost possible way. But someone looks at that and they say, well, you know, I'd really like to get some more reductions out of the refinery sector. So let's put in place an additional policy that affects the refinery standard, and that's the low carbon fuel standard. Okay? So we put that in place for that one sector of the economy. Well, what happens? Well, that sector of the economy now has more permits than it needs because it's reduced emissions even more. What does it do with those permits? Is it just going to throw them away? Those are cash. These are worth thousands of dollars, indeed millions of dollars. So they sell them to someone else in another sector that didn't get this additional regulation. So what happened? We reduced emissions somewhat additionally, which is what someone wanted in the refinery sector, but we're going to see emissions go up by precisely the same amount in another sector. We did not gain any additional CO2 emissions reductions. We simply relocated the emissions. Now, if that was all there was, then you'd say, well, then it's useless. You know, why even put in place these other policies? But they're not doing any harm. They just don't do any good. But they actually do harm. And the reason they do is that in addition to achieving no incremental emissions reductions, just relocating the emissions, as I said, it's also the case now that we'll no longer have a cost-effective allocation of responsibility. We have too much control in one sector. We have that sector at a higher marginal abatement cost than other sectors. So that means aggregate costs have gone up. We put in place an additional regulation. We thought this is a really good thing. We've done nothing in terms of the environment, and we've driven up costs overall under the original policy. Now that would be bad enough, but that's not the end of the story. It also means that by reducing the demand for allowances, the price of allowances is suppressed. And when the allowance price is suppressed, that's the worst possible thing for inspiring technological change. So, and that, as I've just described to you, is precisely what is happening in the European Union. It is one but not of the only reasons for the very low allowance prices. It's because they have very strong energy efficiency policies. They have extremely strong renewable policies and subsidies, such as in Germany and other parts of the country. And it's those so-called complementary policies then that turn out to be not only ineffective, but actually counterproductive. So many so-called complementary policies are nothing of the kind. Oh, and by the way, this is something that people in California within the agencies are aware of now, and so we're on a weekly basis discussing this, and with hopes that in California there will be increased recognition that if they want to have a cap and trade system, they don't have to, but if they want that, then only have the complementary policies that are really complementary, not the ones that conflict. So there is some learning going on. If you ever invite me back here, I hope I can tell you that the problem's been solved. Now, other lessons. One of them is that initially the allowances were given out for free. Remember I told you that we sold them? More and more are auctioned over time, which is a very good thing because you can do something with that money. You could do what the economists would like. Economists would say the best thing to do with that money is to cut taxes that are distortionary, that discourage labor, that discourage investment. That'll actually reduce the overall social cost of the program. Under California law, that is illegal. So it would be illegal to have a carbon tax in California. It is illegal to have auctioned permits in California for which the auction revenues are used for reducing carbon taxes. And that has to, again, let's leave it for Q&A, and if you're interested, I'll tell you why they're trapped in this situation. So they started out with a free initial allocation. Again, from an economic perspective, not a great design, but from a political perspective, a marvelous design, because it's a way of lessening opposition. in the regulated industries. So they started out with a lot of free allocation. They're going to more auctioning over time, which is precisely what the Waxman-Markey, the federal legislation, did. It's also demonstrated that an economy-wide system is feasible. In Europe, they didn't put in an economy-wide system because of some political economy issues regarding the European Commission and the Council of Nations. But it's much more effective than a sectoral system, which is what some countries seem to think more about, such as in Japan, of focusing on one sector at a time. The price collar has been effective. Remember, this is what keeps prices from going too high or too low and makes it into really a hybrid of a tax and a cap-and-trade mechanism. And let's talk about competitiveness. So remember I said, let me just eliminate that. Remember I said that competitiveness is a huge issue. As soon as any jurisdiction wants to put in place any policy, it doesn't have to be an environmental policy, but it's a policy, a regulatory policy that's going to drive up the costs of producing goods and services in that jurisdiction, immediately the worry comes about, quite understandably, wait, we're increasing the price of producing wrought iron in Beloit, aren't the factories going to relocate somewhere else? Or if they're not actually going to relocate, aren't the new factories that are built going to be somewhere else? It's a very sensible concern. So that's the concern of international competitiveness. And the way most jurisdictions have chosen to deal with this, and the way they do it in Europe, is they say, well, you know what we'll do? We'll just give them the allowances for free. Instead of auctioning any, we'll give them the allowances for free. It lowers their costs. They won't go away. It does absolutely nothing for competitiveness. It makes those companies that receive the free allowances happy because those free allowances are essentially cash, millions of dollars. They put it in the bank. But let me explain why it does nothing for competitiveness. So you have a small hardware store, right? And this is a strange kind of hardware store because you manufacture hammers and you sell hammers. And you can do it at a certain price, but it's not so cheap for you to manufacture hammers because you don't make that many. And then, oh my God, Home Depot goes in 3 blocks away. They can make hammers really cheap, they can sell them really cheap, and it's really hard to compete. You just cannot sell for that price. And then I come along and I say, I'll tell you what, I'm going to give you a check. Because remember, the free allowances are cash. I'm just going to give you a lot of cash. And I give you $10,000. Are you any more able now than you were before to compete on a hammer-by-hammer basis with Home Depot? No, you got $10,000, put it in the bank, go to Tahiti, whatever you want to do, but you still can't produce hammers like they can produce hammers. You can't match their price for hammers unless you want to lose money. So it doesn't do anything for competitiveness. And giving away the allowances for free in Europe has therefore had no effect. Cement companies in France are very, very happy about getting those free allowances, millions of dollars. Their next facilities will nevertheless be built in Algeria because of much lower costs of production. And the reason, to use a little bit of jargon, is that that grant of those allowances is inframarginal. It's not on the margin of the number of hammers produced. It's not on the margin of the amount of pollution control. So attempts at competitiveness protection under the EU ETS are ineffective, and I've been telling them this, and I'm sure others have for years. But there's another approach, and that is, let's go back to the hardware store, if you'll forgive me, and that is if instead I come to you and I say at your hardware store, I'll tell you, for every hammer you sell, I'm going to give you $1. That's the same as lowering your cost of production of hammers by $1. I changed it from inframarginal, this check, no matter what you do, into $1 per hammer. It's called a production subsidy, which has its own problems in economics. But I've now made it on the margin. And there's a way that this is done, and California does it. And the legislation that was in the Congress, the Waxman-Markey bill, did it. And it's a terrible phrase, an output-based updating allocation. It means the number of allowances you get in this period is due to the amount of your production in the previous period, whether that's electricity or hammers or cars or anything else. That makes it on the margin. And so in California, this is reducing competitiveness problems. It is reducing leakage, that is, the relocation of industrial and other facilities outside of the state. Now, it doesn't solve the problem completely for various reasons, but it has tremendous effects. So it's been one of the important lessons. Leakage risks remain in the electricity sector. I know there are people here from a tremendous amount of experience in that sector because of what is called contract reshuffling. California imports 50% of its electricity from outside of the state. However, it cannot regulate companies in Nevada as much as it thinks it should be able to. There is the U.S. Constitution preventing that. So what they regulate is the first seller of electricity in the state, right? They say it has to be green electricity. But I don't know if you've seen green electrons. I haven't. They're all the same. All electrons are the same. So the utility out of state that says, oh, we're sending you the green stuff is just sending the brown stuff somewhere else. That's contract reshuffling. It is virtually impossible to prevent unless more states get on board with policy. So that still remains. Ultimately, the only way to eliminate all these competitiveness concerns and all the leakage issues is through a broader coalition of action. In the case of the U.S., more states, but actually it's much more than that. It also means more countries. So since it means it's important nationally to broaden the California regime, let me turn briefly to talk about the national level, back to the national context. Now, this notion of carbon pricing, which I've raised with you, is very much a hot-button issue in the United States. Why is that? Well, one of the reasons is it makes the cost transparent. We were hearing earlier today from one of the speakers an interesting presentation in which carbon taxes were celebrated because they're transparent. That's the worst possible thing for a policy instrument, to be transparent about charging people money. That's worst. What you want to do is make benefits visible and make costs hidden, put them under the rug, if you want the policy to be politically successful. The problem with carbon pricing mechanisms, and we knew it was true of taxes, and it turns out it's true of cap and trade if people think enough about it, is that they make the costs more transparent, unlike conventional policy instruments that are more costly, but they hide the costs. And I could give you examples, but that would take too much time. Also, cap and trade has been easily associated with the T word, the tax word. Indeed, in Washington, the way conservatives demonized cap and trade was as cap and tax. What that makes me think about putting in place a carbon tax instead is that, well, if we could demonize cap and trade as cap and tax, I suppose it's pretty easy to demonize a tax as a tax, which is what leads me to think that that's not likely to be a more successful route without a lot of other adjustments and aspects. Now, there's some irony here, because this antipathy from conservatives, and in saying this, by the way, I want to take note of the fact that I am highly bipartisan. And no one that takes my class for 26 sessions at Harvard knows if I'm a Republican, a Democrat, I'm actually neither, where I stand on the issues, and I celebrate that fact. And I would be failing as an instructor if I allowed my values to intervene. So I've worked with White Houses of both parties. I've worked with Republican administrations and Democratic administrations, members of Congress on both sides of the aisle. But I'll tell you that the antipathy by conservatives to cap and trade is ironic because of the experience. President Reagan brought us the leaded gasoline phase down, which was essentially a cap and trade mechanism. President George H.W. Bush brought us the acid rain cut by half in 1990. That's the program in which I worked at the White House on it. And then President George W. Bush, in his Clean Air Interstate Rule, sought to use cap and trade to cut SO2, sulfur dioxide emissions, by an additional 70%, below what had already been done, the 50%. But for various reasons that don't have to do with that policy instrument, that was invalidated by the courts, but temporarily it's back in force. So my view is that cap and trade, the reasons conservatives have been attacked it so much recently, is really collateral damage, I'll call it, in a battle against climate action. And I think that the opposition to climate action is itself a consequence of political polarization, a phenomenon that the political scientists could tell us about that is much larger, much more significant than climate policy, environmental policy, or anything else. That's, in my view, what is driving this. And it's for that reason that I say that a meaningful carbon pricing policy is unlikely in the foreseeable future until we get beyond the political polarization that we have, which comes from particular structural factors, and unfortunately I don't see those turning around anytime soon. So does that mean there will be no U.S. climate policy? Well, the good news is, I guess, the answer is no to that, and part of the reason is that there already is. So I'm going to talk about only one small aspect of it, is that there was a U.S. Supreme Court decision which led to an EPA decision, which has led to some regulatory actions under the Clean Air Act. There is a Supreme Court decision in 2007, Massachusetts v. EPA, and that essentially required the government to consider regulation of mobile sources. Didn't say they had to do it, but they had to consider it. They had to determine whether or not carbon dioxide emissions were endangering public health and environment. That went before the George W. Bush administration. They punted on it, didn't make a decision, so it went into the Obama administration. When they came into office, then in 2009, they issued a finding, which I actually questioned the finding itself, frankly, but they issued a finding that said that these emissions of carbon dioxide endanger public health and welfare. That's human health they're talking about, not the usual impacts we think of with climate change, at least for this country. And that meant that EPA was required. It's now required to regulate mobile sources, which the administration did with some very ambitious fuel efficiency standards that are now in place, that are going to bring down the they're going to bring up the fuel efficiency, bring down the use of gasoline tremendously in the United States as the vehicle fleet turns over. But it also meant that as soon as they put in place those mobile sources, that it meant that EPA was defining carbon dioxide as a pollutant under a particular part of the Clean Air Act, which unfortunately was not designed for global commons pollutants. It was designed for local air pollution. You know, sulfur dioxide and NOx and ozone and carbon monoxide and lead. That's what it was designed for. But it meant that EPA is now required to issue regulations, both for new and existing stationary sources. And they decided to move first with rules for power plants. I put first in quotation marks because I think they've decided there's not going to be a second. Originally, the second was going to be refineries. So what happened? Well, the first thing is they put in place about a year ago a regulation for new power plants, which essentially outlawed new coal-fired power plants unless they could sequester and store all of the carbon dioxide emissions, which is not something which is commercially possible, certainly at present. So it essentially had the effect of outlawing new coal-fired power plants. And conservatives at the time said, this is horrible, it's going to cost ratepayers a fortune. And a lot of environmentalists said, this is fantastic, it's going to be great for the environment. And of course, both were wrong. It'll have no effect whatsoever because there aren't any new coal-fired power plants being built on the horizon because of low natural gas prices. So that was not of significance. But the next shoe that dropped was very important. And that's the rule that came out in June of this year for existing power plants. It's called the Clean Power Plan. And that calls for a 30% reduction overall in the United States in carbon dioxide emissions by 2030 below the 2005 level. That's very significant potentially. The way the rule is designed, I won't take you through it, the way it's designed, it facilitates, through allowing flexibility, the possibility of cost effectiveness. The possibility of states using carbon taxes, states using cap and trade mechanisms, linkages across states, that's all presumably would be allowed. But it doesn't require cost effectiveness. It's not putting in place a carbon pricing regime. I want to ask a more challenging question with you. Is it efficient? Which in economics means, does it maximize welfare? But that's too difficult a question to address. It's too high a threshold, so I'm going to ask one that's not quite as ambitious. A weaker criterion, does it enhance welfare? Does it make the U.S. better off than we were without it? And a way to think about that, are the benefits greater than the costs? Are the benefits to the United States of this regulation greater than the costs of this regulation, right? So the fundamental economic arithmetic of a global commons problem would cause you to be skeptical about that right away. We talked about that at the beginning, because remember, the benefits are spread globally, the costs are incurred locally, and for that matter, the damages of climate change are going to be much worse in the developing world than in the industrialized world, much worse in the tropical regions than the temperate regions, much worse in the areas that depend upon agriculture, not the industrialized countries. So given that, it would be very surprising, since for a country like the US, inevitably the benefits of our taking direct action are going to be less, the direct benefits will be less than the direct costs in terms of climate change. So it would be surprising, to say the least, if EPA were to find that the expected benefits of the proposed rule, that's the regulation, would exceed the expected cost. But EPA actually had to carry out a benefit cost analysis. It's called a regulatory impact analysis. They did that, and that's exactly what EPA found. In fact, its central estimate of what's called net benefits, which means benefits minus costs, is by the year 2030, $67 billion. I don't know if you can read that in red, sorry. It says $67 billion annually in the year 2030. Positive net benefits. So my question is, how can that possibly be? And so forgive me, I'm going to take you through some numbers so you can see where that comes from. So the first thing is down in the lower right, circled in red, you can see $67 billion. But let's take a look at something else. And that is, if we were looking at just climate change, and we're looking at impacts on the United States, remember, benefits the United States, costs to the United States. Does this have a laser? I probably have to turn it on. On? Oh, that's not good. I don't think I'll touch that again. And if I walk over there, you won't, there's no cordless here. Okay, so look at the far left column. Climate change, for the US, they estimated that the climate change benefits would be $3 billion. This is the Obama administration, EPA. So the total benefit's $3 billion, and they estimated the compliance costs would be $9 billion. Now, a lot of economists have looked at that. They say that compliance cost estimate is a tremendous underestimate, but let's take it as given. That means that there are negative net benefits, minus $6 billion. That shouldn't be a surprise. That's just validating that it's a global commons problem, right? That the benefits are spread globally. You only get a small part of the benefits. You pay all the costs. So how did they find what they found? Where the first way is that in a departure from almost all previous a departure from all previous regulatory impact analysis until the Obama administration came into power, they were always using the geographic limits for these regulatory impact analysis as the United States or the citizens of the United States. That's the way they always looked at it. So when we're looking at the benefits and costs of an employment policy that helps employment in the US and hurts employment in Mexico, we don't subtract that from the benefits in an analysis. That doesn't happen. It's never happened, okay? Now, an argument can be made that that approach we've used in the past is simply inappropriate, because we're talking about a global commons problem, and to only look at benefits and costs to the United States would simply be validating the free rider issue and doing nothing more. So the government in the administration, they said, we're not going to look at benefits only to the US, we're going to look at benefits to everybody. And when they did that, they get $31 billion of benefits, and then the costs are the same, so now the net benefits are positive, $22 billion. But that still doesn't get us to the $67 billion. And this is where it gets more interesting, because they took note of the fact, well, that the big effect on the environment of cutting down on coal is really not climate change from an economic perspective. It's that the coal emits a lot of other stuff. It emits mercury, it emits sulfur dioxide, it emits NOx, and most important of all, from a human health perspective, it emits particulates, small particles that lodge deep in your lungs. You know, the capillaries get smaller and smaller, so they go deeper and deeper into the lungs. This leads not just to morbidity, but to premature mortality. So they looked at the health co-benefits that this CO2 policy would have on reducing particulates. And when they did that, they came up with $45 billion using the EPA methodology that's typically used. So now, if you take that $45 billion from the health impacts, look at it for just the U.S., since the health benefits are all localized, so it is just the U.S., there's no global issue here. Then we have positive net benefits of $39 billion, and if you throw in global benefits worldwide, you get to the $67 billion. Now, I put this up, I have a blog, An Economic View of the Environment, about once a month, and I had written this up on the blog, and if you go there, you'll see there are comments that I submit everyone's comments unless there's vile language. And so the comments are up there, and it's interesting or amusing. So people that are favoring climate policy and are very aggressive and very green, they looked at the analysis and they write, so Stavins with these numbers have validated the wisdom of the Clean Power Plan. It's a really good idea. And then conservatives and climate skeptics and all the others on the right, they wrote it and said, look at this, Stavins has validated the Clean Power Plan is a complete loser. It's idiotic. So I'm not going to form a judgment for this. I'm bipartisan. So I leave it up to you. You form whatever judgment that you want. And I suspect that your judgment will be dependent upon what your priors are of whether or not you want to have more climate policy or not. Now, before I run out of time, I want to recognize that international cooperation, as I said at the beginning, is ultimately going to be necessary because of this global commons nature of the problem, which is one of the things this chart really shows us. So I want to try to take a quick view of international negotiations and to place them into perspective. It's an economics perspective. But in doing this, I'm going to use a cliche from sports that you've all experienced. So when my home team, the Boston Red Sox, win in April, if they lose their first 10 games, the reporters go down into the dugout after that 10th game, 10 straight losses, and they say to the players, well, this is really a disaster. This is just horrendous. And you know what the players always say? They always say, well, you know, the baseball season is 162 games long. We've only played 10. Baseball is a marathon, not a sprint. That is even more true about climate change. And there are very specific reasons why I say this. Climate change policy is a marathon, not a sprint. We have to think about the temporal dimension. And the first reason is scientifically that this is what I'm going to call a stock, not a flow environmental problem. What does that mean? It means that the damages are not a consequence of the amount of emissions in any year. The damages are a consequence of the stock that's accumulated in the atmosphere. Because we're pumping up the emissions, and they do decay out, but they decay out extremely slowly. So it's like we've got a bathtub. The damages are a function of the amount of water in the bathtub. Water's coming out of the faucet, and we've got a clogged drain that drains very slowly. And the atmosphere does have a drain for that carbon dioxide. It mainly precipitates out into the oceans and acidifies the oceans, but it does it very slowly with a half-life of 100 years. So that means that for practical purposes, for you and me, it's essentially just accumulating. It's a stock. So that's the first reason why you have to have this long-term perspective on the actions we're going to take. Don't worry about what the emissions reduction is next year. Think about the stock over time. And there are a lot of different pathways to get there. Second, economically, the cost-effective path to get to any stock target in the future is always going to involve, in every analysis that I've seen, economic analysis from all over the world except one, the path is a very gradual ramp up in the severity of targets. And why is that? It's to avoid unnecessary premature obsolescence of the capital stock. In other words, if we're going to put in place an aggressive climate policy, I want to make sure the next time you buy a car, it's a lot more fuel efficient. I'm not going to put in place a climate policy that takes your car tomorrow and grinds it up. I'm not going to put in place a policy that's going to close down all coal-fired power plants tomorrow that still have useful life, or natural gas plants that have useful life. But I want a policy that when we have new investment in that industry, we're going to see that investment in natural gas, renewables, and for that matter, nuclear power. Okay? And it's because of that it's a gradual ramp up of activity that is cost effective. Then economically also, remember I said technological change is key, and hence a long-term price path is essential for signals because people and firms react to the long term. And finally, something I've learned is that administratively, the creation of durable international institutions is essential. You know, in Bretton Woods in New Hampshire in 1945, in the wake of World War II, nations met in order to put together a new world economic order. And it took 50 years from then in order to get to the point of having the World Trade Organization, of having the IMF function the way it was. You know, in the short term, they rebuilt Europe, and there was a lot left to be done. This problem is as difficult. So long-term institutions are an essential part of the story. So what does this tell me? This tells me that the international climate negotiations are going to be an ongoing process, much like trade talks there are. No one thinks that the trade talks next year are going to solve all our problems. It's an ongoing issue. This is going to be an ongoing issue. And the way I judge the success of any negotiation is not what it does for emissions, but what it does in terms of putting the world on a path for a sensible architecture for the long term to bring down emissions seriously. Now, in order to think about that approach, so I've been engaged, as Warren mentioned, in leading a project, the Harvard Project on Climate Agreements, and our purpose is to help identify what the key design elements might be of a scientifically sound, economically sensible, politically pragmatic, international policy architecture for climate change. And although it's called the Harvard Project, we draw on research and ideas from leading thinkers around the world, from academia, economics, political science, law, international relations, from private industry, from NGOs, and for governments. And we have 50 research initiatives, Argentina, Australia, China, Europe, India, Japan, and the United States. I'm not going to take you through what are now 75 discussion papers and 3 books, but rather tell you what 4 lessons are that have come out of this work. The first one is that market-based approaches are essential. I think I've made that point throughout. But second, that getting the carbon prices right is necessary, but it's not sufficient. And one of the primary reasons it comes up here when we think of these climate negotiations and the long term is best expressed, let's see if I can dim that, yes I can, with this. So those of you who are sitting the distance, all of you that are sitting the distance that you are away from me, you cannot tell whether or not this is an iPhone or whether it is a different device called a Blackberry Storm 2. Made by a company that still exists called Blackberry in Canada. Now, the reason is they're exactly the same in terms of appearance. They're both smartphones. They both have touch screens. They look exactly alike. Blackberry did not buy patent rights from Apple. Apple was first. Blackberry did not violate patent rights. There was no lawsuit like there was with Samsung. So think about this. Apple Corporation did a tremendous amount of research and development, incredibly costly before they could even begin to think about manufacturing the first iPhone. They paid all the costs of the R&D. Did they get all the benefits of the R&D? No. There were spillover benefits to others. And you can see this, and economists have been tracing this. It's a huge area of economic research for 50 years. Trace this by looking at patents and the citation of patents. There's learning from others, and that means that there's a problem. And the problem is the public good nature of R&D. Information is a public good. Anyone can use that information. And what that means is, because there's this positive externality, the private sector systematically underinvests in R&D. It's a known phenomena, it's been quantified, and it's been examined countless times by economists, including my former dissertation advisors, V. Grillicus. So it's a huge area of research. What that means is that even if we get the prices right with the carbon tax or with the cap and trade mechanism, we're still going to have a problem for the long term in terms of encouraging a sufficient amount of invention and innovation. So we'll need to have also some direct technology policies. And that might be government funding of private sector R&D, such as for carbon capture and storage or safe nuclear power, or it might be research at government labs. Unfortunately, this is an area where it's easier to say we need the policies than to design sensible ones. The third lesson is that developing country, and I put it in parentheses, participation is essential. And this is because even if the OECD countries, that's essentially the industrialized world, if we were to reduce our emissions to zero, nevertheless global emissions would continue to increase. Because in fact, emissions from the OECD countries are flat to declining. They're flat to declining. But global emissions are increasing very fast and faster each year. And the reason that's happening is because of countries that are not in the industrialized world. No, I'm not talking about the poorest developing countries in sub-Saharan Africa or small island states. I'm talking about a specific set of countries that are large and growing fast, and we love the fact they're growing fast. It's wonderful for their populations. It's wonderful for all of us. And it's China, India, Brazil, Korea, South Africa, Mexico, and Indonesia. Large emerging economies. China, 8% economic growth per year. The economy more than doubles in less than 10 years. That's where the emissions growth is coming from. So the first lesson here is that those countries need to be involved. I want you to keep separate, however, whether or not they have to pay for it, but they've got to do something. How it's funded is a different issue we'll try to come to. So a central task for the international negotiations is bringing those key emerging economies on board. That's really the challenge now. I'm going to skip that last one. So thinking about these international negotiations, to put this into historical context, it started in 1992. That was the Rio Earth Summit. And what came out of that Earth Summit, which was the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, was not some conventions, some agreements that addressed the environmental problems of developing countries. You might think it would, given that it was called the Conference on Environment and Development, because the problems of developing countries, the environmental problems then and now, were indoor air pollution from cooking with biomass in poor developing countries, burning wood or dung or other forms of biomass, with poor ventilation. And next year, 15 million people will die next year, mainly women and children, because that's who are in those kitchens. 15 million people next year, and the year after that, and the year after that. Nor did it address another environmental problem in the developing world, and these are the two most serious environmental problems in the world, in my view, and that's contaminated water supplies. Essentially surface water supplies that are contaminated because of poor sanitation, and waste gets in there. People get dysentery, largely children get dysentery, dehydration, mortality. 15 million people next year. So those were the real environmental problems, but back at the Rio Earth Summit, even though it was called Environment and Development, the northern countries, us, the NGOs, the countries from the north, captured it. And we got what we wanted, Convention on Biodiversity, not something they were thinking about in those developing countries when they're trying to find enough to eat and would like more farmland, but something that we care about now. In our stage of development, we care about biodiversity, as we should, and global climate change, which we cared a lot about. So what came out of it was the United Nations Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC. It had in it a very important principle of equity, which we haven't talked about yet, distributional equity. And the principle is known as common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, meaning that, look, we're all in it together, it's a global commons problem, but some countries are more responsible for the accumulated emissions we've gotten from all these years of industrialization, namely the United States is #1 in cumulative emissions. And some countries are richer than others, so they're more capable of doing something. So it's a principle of distributional equity. That's fine, but then 3 years later, at the first of what are now annual conferences in the negotiations in Berlin, the very first decision of this first conference was to interpret that principle, the CBDR, in a very specific way, namely a dichotomous distinction. Not sort of if you're richer, you control more, you have more responsibility. Not if you've put more up in the atmosphere, you control more. So not a gradation, but rather a 0-1. A particular list of countries, which are called the Annex 1 countries because they're in an appendix, they have targets. All the other countries have no targets whatsoever, importantly including those emerging economies. The Kyoto Protocol, just two years later, is the standing international agreement. It put numbers on that approach, that dichotomous distinction. So it came out with quantitative targets for the Annex I countries only. There's a problem. As I said, the Annex I countries, the rich countries of the world, even though on an equity basis you can certainly argue it, they can't do it on their own because their emissions are already flat to declining. The growth is elsewhere. Furthermore, it's a pretty bad equity principle because of the fact that 50 non-Annex I countries have higher per capita income than the poorest of the Annex I countries, Romania. So even if you would argue for it, it's sort of out of kilter. The Gulf states, some of the richest countries in the world on a per capita basis, Qatar is #1 in the world in per capita income. It's a non-Annex I country. It's only the industrialized countries, the OECD countries, that are in there. And then finally, this dichotomous distinction, you're either in or out, makes progress impossible, because if you're out, you're going to do anything you can to not go in. There's no gradation, there's no graduation. Now, things began to change in 2009 in Copenhagen and the annual negotiations a year later in Cancun. The distinction between Annex I and non-Annex I began to blur. And then in 2011, something happened in the annual negotiations in Durban, South Africa. In addition to extending the Kyoto Protocol, a new agreement was reached. It's called the Durban Platform for Enhanced Action, and it is simply a mandate for the countries of the world to reach a new agreement by 2015 for implementation in 2020, when the Kyoto Protocol essentially ends. And the key is that all countries are under the same legal framework. That's the statement that's there, more or less. Okay? So this breaks with the Berlin Mandate. This breaks from this entire path of what's debilitated and made impossible progress in international negotiations, namely this dichotomous distinction. And it really does set, in my view, the negotiations potentially on a new path. Now, this does not satisfy what I refer to here as the 350.org crowd, people who want abrupt reductions in emissions everywhere all the time next year. And it probably annoys the opponents of climate policy at all, because it actually may accomplish something. But in the real world of international climate negotiations, I have to tell you, this is what success looks like. Now, with that, let me wrap up by talking about the path ahead to COP21 in Paris, because that's where the agreement has to be reached, is in Paris in December 2015. On the way there, we'll be having negotiations. I'll be in Lima, Peru in less than a month. The kind of agreements that's being discussed now is what is called a hybrid policy architecture. It's one that combines elements of bottom-up, individual, not negotiating the targets for countries, but each country saying what they can do based upon what is politically achievable, scientifically achievable, economic, whatever within. And then some top-down elements which are essentially for oversight, coordination, and guidance. Now, I can tell you now, and I think that this is and most analysts who I know think this is a very, very solid, very promising step forward as the next step, not as the solution, as the next step. But I can predict now that in Paris, when we come out with this hybrid agreement, that in fact, many NGOs, certainly not the Environmental Defense Fund, they're too intelligent for that, but certainly many NGOs, and certainly the press, are going to condemn it as a tremendous failure. And if you don't mind, I'm going to give you my last metaphor, and then I'll wrap up, of why I think they'll condemn it and why I think they're wrong. Because this is if you and I are walking down the street, and we see a construction site across the street, and there's a fence up around the construction site, and there's a picture of the building that's going to go up, and a big sign, 70-story office condominium complex, 70 stories. And we walk across the street and we see that, well, they've got the second floor up already. We look over the fence, pretty good. And then we take a closer look and we notice that the square footage of the foundation of this building is 10 feet by 10 feet. It's not going to get to 10 stories, let alone 70. It's going to collapse. The foundation is insufficient for long-term achieving what's wanted. What's happening now with the new approach is they're going back and they're building a new foundation. It's a square block. It's a foundation that's the right size to support that structure, that long-term structure. But what's going to happen in Paris is that people are going to be walking by that construction site and they're going to look across and say, well, gee, a couple of years ago with Kyoto, we were up 2 stories, and now they're down at the level of the foundation. We're going backwards. It's a failure. I predict that's what you're going to see in the press. And maybe you'll see a quote by some economists and others that'll say, well, it's actually not a failure. Actually, although it looks like we're not as high up, we've got a really good foundation now for long-term action. But the key questions really are, nevertheless, can this kind of approach, this bottom-up approach, achieve sufficient ambition? Because after all, it's a global commons problem. Everyone's doing what they volunteer. We're not going to get a lot. So the big question is, are there ways to enable and to facilitate increased ambition over time? One way is linkage of regional, national, and subnational climate policy, something on which we're working and on which I'll be in Lima in just a month to report on research we've been doing of what needs to be in the agreement to facilitate this kind of linkage, because for solid pragmatic reasons, this can have the effect of increasing ambition over time. But the full answer is only going to be forthcoming in Paris 1 year from now, so both you and I will have to wait for that, unfortunately. Finally, I guess what I've tried to do, and you'll be the judge of this, I won't, is to demonstrate to you that environmental economics, at least in my little example with climate change, is not oxymoronic, that an economic perspective is essential, really, for a full understanding of environmental problems, and therefore it's the key to design of solutions which are environmentally effective, which are not just symbolic in nature, but really do something about the problem, that are economically sensible, that they're cost effective, we're not wasting resources unnecessarily, and that because of this, they may be more likely, if properly designed, to be politically pragmatic. I've run through a lot of information, I know, particularly to those of you who this is new to. I apologize for that. However, I want to suggest that if you go to the websites of the Harvard Project on Climate Agreements, the Harvard Environmental Economics Program, my own website, where everything I've written since I was in kindergarten is available as a PDF file for downloading, to my blog, or as they say, you can follow me on Twitter, any of those. And again, thank you very much to the Beloit College community. Thank you. Thank you very much. And I understand from Professor Palmer, from Warren, that we're going to take questions. Okay. And there's a microphone here, so if you have a question or a comment or whatever, if you put up your hand, then young lady, student, what year? Sophomore. We haven't met in class, though. I think you're one of the few students I haven't met yet. Any questions? Here's one.
What would be a sign of failure in Paris?
So the question was, what would be a sign of failure in Paris? So I think that failure is possible. In my opinion, it will not be on that agreement that I was talking about, the actual Durban Platform for Enhanced Action hybrid policy. It's something else, is that I can tell you a story, and that is that in 2009 was the big Copenhagen conference that everyone hoped was going to solve the problem. And you know, the way international negotiations work is that they're not really, heads of state negotiating, they're not ministers. It's the people like the students in the audience. 3 years from now, they're going to be working at a ministry in some country or at a department in the United States. That's who's doing all the work. And so the negotiations every year are 2 weeks long. And so the first week and then Monday and Tuesday of the second week, that's who's doing all the work. And they get as far as they can in the negotiations. And then what's called the ministerials. This is true of trade negotiations, true of lots of negotiations, not just climate. the ministerial starts. And so the ministers come in. Well, in the case of the United States, the minister in charge was, of course, Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton. So Hillary Clinton flies in on Wednesday, and the idea is there might be a few remaining problems that it just took that political clout to do, so you need the ministers. And in addition to working on that political clout, which unfortunately did not succeed, the president was required 2 days later, she made a statement. And she said that, well, in order to help poorer countries of the world, the richer countries should commit to a fund to help them by the year 2020. Secretary Clinton, how large should that fund be? $100 billion. Everyone that I know on the White House staff passed out when she said that. That has become the international target. It's completely accepted around the world. $100 billion into a specific fund from the industrialized countries. It has been capitalized so far to a level of $9 billion, contributions from Germany, France, Scandinavian countries, and New Zealand. If that fund does not get to a level that is considered by the poorest countries, really, they're the ones concerned, like sub-Saharan Africa, then those countries might walk out. And given that the voting mechanism in these discussions under the General Assembly is consensus, that is virtually unanimity. If a sizable number of countries walk out, that just closes down the negotiations. So I think that's the one way it could blow up, would be on the $100 billion. Over here, there's a question right there.
Hi, I was wondering if you would be willing to expand upon some feasible options for incentivizing participation when we have this continuum of development among nations and there's not really like a clear break.
Yeah, so great question. So how could we, given that there's this continuous distribution of per capita income and lots of other measures of quality of life and the like, how could we then come up with something which would be a little more sophisticated, a little more subtle? And there are a variety of ways. One way is, which you can read about from the Harvard Project on Climate Agreements, and I won't take credit for it. It's by two people, my colleague Jeffrey Frankel at Harvard, who's a trade economist actually for the most part, and another economist at the University of Milan, Valentino Bassetti. So they've done work in proposing that a way to set targets would be with a specific formula, and the formula they use is one which brings in historical emissions, because that's something that, for instance, India cares a lot about. That hits the United States hard. That would look at current emissions, that would look at per capita income, that looks at a whole set of measures and looks at bringing all countries towards, I didn't say reaching, equal per capita emissions by the end of the century, which is what, on an ethical basis, and certainly poorer countries would like to see. So when they looked at this as a model, they do simulations with it, they found that it is feasible with that to achieve 550 parts per million, which is not the 450 parts per million that many scientists and others now talk about. However, and we used to talk about, I used to take this before negotiators for 4 years, but now they've moved away from that kind of top-down, we're going to negotiate the targets. So right now they don't want to hear anything about a formula. There's a new use for it, however, which I am going to resuscitate in Lima, and that is a very important element of the bottom-up is to be able to compare all these targets. And that's going to be an excellent mechanism to use in part of the top-down part as a way of comparing the ambition of different countries.
Thank you. I have a question more on the international side, on the international negotiation going on around the climate change, and that is that when inevitably there is a divide between developed and developing countries, and what many developing countries often bring up in those negotiations is that the Western countries got to their level of economic output where they are now, largely through unrestricted, long period of emission and pollution. Right. And they argue, in my opinion, quite validly, asking why should we, at this point of our development, why should we take on this burden of committing to reducing targets? So I wonder what your response to that would be and how to get those countries on board.
So I think that that's absolutely valid, that if we were to say to countries of the world, all countries of the world, like one of the ways of being cost effective would be everyone has to face the same shadow price, the same marginal cost, whatever the device might be, you know, global carbon tax or anything else. And if we were to say that, we would essentially be saying to the poorest of the developing countries, thanks guys, we had an industrial revolution over the last 150 years, you're not having one. You're going to remain as an agrarian state. So that's completely untenable, it's unreasonable. But recognize that what I'm talking about, what's essential, is not to bring in those approximately 100 poor countries. They account for 10% of global emissions. 90% of global emissions are counted for by the OECD and the emerging economies that I mentioned. That's who needs to be in the agreement. That's what's essential. So other countries, there's no reason to punish them. Their emissions are trivial at this point in time. They need to grow.
Been working Professor Stavins very hard while he's been on campus. So I think we can take one more question, a terrific question. A pretty darn good question.
Professor Stavins, you mentioned that there's often complementary policy that is called complementary but not actually complementary. I was wondering if the experience you've had with California has shown that is it obvious if these are complementary policies or not actually complementary policies being called that before they're enacted, or is that something that is really only seen after the fact?
Well, by that, thank you for the question. It brings my existence at Beloit College full circle, since you're one of the very first students I met when you came over to pick me up. So thanks for the question. The reality is that the policies in some cases were in place. Then cap and trade came along. But in terms of the ones that I mentioned, those came in together with the cap and trade. It's all part of AB 32. Now, in terms of what people recognize, most people don't recognize this. I mean, you know, I don't want to be offensive to, you know, to California. But I've talked to a lot of legislators there, of both parties. In fact, I'm really thinking of a Democratic legislator as I tell this story. I can picture her in her office. She's smart, well-intentioned, and she was absolutely shocked when I said to her in our conversation, she recognized that reducing emissions in her district were not going to improve the weather in her district. So absolutely no understanding whatsoever of the scientific dimensions of the problem in terms of a global commons problem. So I only say that to say, given that that's not understood, the sort of thing that we're discussing, which is complementary policies and leading to all these issues, that is very remote from legislators' thinking. However, there is an agency in California which is excellent. And it's not actually called they do have an Environmental Protection Agency, but they have something else, which is within that, which is called the Air Resources Board, the California Air Resources Board, led by a fantastic person, Mary Nichols, who is a lawyer for Natural Resources Defense Council for years. She was in the Clinton administration, head of the Air and Radiation Office. She's very smart. She's a lawyer. She really understands. She knows what she doesn't know, which is one of the greatest things for anyone, is to know what you don't know. And she knows she needs economists. She's got economists on board. She understands this. Politically, it's going to be very, very difficult because there are constituencies behind the renewable electricity standards. You can picture who those would be. There are, you know, they want more renewables per se, right? So there are constituencies behind the low carbon fuel standard. There are constituencies supporting each of these other policies. So politically, it's going to be very challenging, but it's understood in the Air Resources Board.
Well, I want to thank you all, and I want to thank Professor Stavins for a terrific 4 days. Couple brief announcements. We have a reception upstairs. Also, in the back of the room, we have the proceedings from last year's Upton Forum. And on your way out, please pick up the card that announces next year's Upton Forum and next year's Upton Scholar. Let us now please thank Professor Stavins for his great time.
Thank you.